Does anyone have a clue as to why is this group so problematic? G, Beshak, huh? Okay, you hit the nail on the head. So the Mujaddidis are the defenders of orthodoxy, and the Wahhabis did two things that were actually unthinkable, which basically go against, of course, Hanafi fiqh and in fact, all of the schools of fiqh. They perform takfir, which means declaring another Muslim who declares themselves to be a Muslim to be non-believers and worthy of death. And they demean the Prophet and insult the saints. They reduce the, um, the role of the saints and also of the 12 Imams. Now, I'm going to give you an example of Fazl Ahmad's disciples' role in wiping out the Mujahideen movement of Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareilly in the 1820s. Once again, I'm going to ask for a show of hands, Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareilly in the Mujahideen movement. Anyone know this from Pakistan studies or elsewhere? Okay, there's a show of hands here. All right. So here's the basic story. A scholar from North India called Sayyid Ahmad decides it's a much longer story, really doing injustice to it. He decides one day after a fairly lengthy career that he wants to declare jihad against the Sikhs who've taken Punjab and parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So he gets financial support from North India, puts together an army, and then moves through Sindh. It's a very famous story if you know the Sindh one. The Hur movement is connected to this. And then he goes to Kandahar, Kabul, and he ends up in Peshawar, where he declares himself the Amir al-Mu'mineen and wages war against the Afghans themselves and starts declaring local Muslims, those who don't support him, as idol worshippers and potential unbelievers. So, the part of the story that we are not told, and this came out of the sources that I found, and it ended up becoming a whole chunk of one of the chapters here, is that Fazl Ahmad's two most famous Peshawari Khalifas, there's Hafiz Daraz, he's called that because Daraz, he's tall, and Hafiz Azim, they are these kind of mega scholars of Peshawar. They end up leading a full-fledged theological assault against this particular movement. They use fatwas, they use letters, pamphlets, propaganda, they use the pulpits, and eventually get him and his whole movement declared as heretics, claiming that the movement bears traces of the Najdi philosophy of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, Wahhabism. And because of their efforts, and this is also a story which is not well known, for over a century, Wahhabism in all the Pakhtun Afghan regions was actually a four-letter word. And if you've been to Afghanistan, you'll actually know that the W word cannot be used in 98% of the country. I can get back to this later if I'm raising eyebrows. Now, indeed, it's this combination of educational, economic, diplomatic, and political services which allow the Mujaddidi Sufis such easy entry across Asia. So I'm now going to turn to. Oh, by the way, Sayyid Ahmad is also accused of being a British agent. That seems to be a big part of it. And there's a rather interesting backstory to this as well, but I'll leave it at that. So, Bukhara, like Peshawar, offered ample opportunities for Sufis and scholars under the Uzbek Khans of the Mangad dynasty. This is an incredible case study because here we actually find kings who become not only supporters of the Sufis, but trained to become licensed scholars and Sufi guides themselves. Now, Bukhara, of course, has this age-old reputation as the college town par excellence. But by the 18th century, environmental crisis plus Nadir Shah's invasion had wrecked the academies. In fact, Samarkand had kind of been reduced down to 10,000. Only one of the quarters was actually Abad was inhabited. Thank you. Now, by about 1750, an Uzbek family comes to power and began to reconsolidate Bukhara and repopulate the city, which meant bringing in the Mujaddidis who could power up the academic and spiritual scene. At that time, Bukhara's Sufis received considerable patronage, given stipends to travel through the now very rich trade routes to study with Mujaddidi Sufis in the Durrani Empire. So now they're going south to get their diplomas. And once they get their diplomas, generally they come back. And then in addition, you've got a lot of scholars from places like Wazirabad, Sialkot, Peshawar, Kabul, Kandahar, who are now moving northwards to Bukhara because there's ample opportunities. So, It is in this environment that Hazrat Fazl Ahmad arrives in Bukhara in the 1770s. He was granted one of the city's most important madrasas. It's a 17th century madrasa called the Mira Khan, from where he attracted scores of disciples, and it's here that he met the young king Shah Murad. Now, even before meeting Hazrat Fazl Ahmad, Shah Murad was deeply committed to Sufism. He sought only the company of Sufis and ulema. He abandoned all trappings of royalty and even engaged in manual labor. In fact, the salary that he got was from his manual labor. He even, in fact, refused to take on kingship until pressured by the community to assume the position and to rectify the ills of the past. 2 years after his coronation, in 1787, Shah Murad was initiated by Hazrat Fazl Ahmad into the Mujaddidi Sufi path. We are told that Shah Murad would attend Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's sessions every morning and evening, spending several hours at the Sufi center. Eventually, the young king, we are told, excelled in tawajjuh, in sort of spiritual exercise, concentration, to the extent that he and his son were actually appointed among Fazl Ahmad's khalifas. I have the documents, with permission to guide their own students on the Sufi path. So what's the evidence? I've got access to about 100 letters between Hazrat Fazl Ahmad and Shah Murad's son Amir Haydar, who came after him. The questions that the king asks the Pir are remarkable. Highly complex questions about meditation, philosophy. Some of them are very honest questions. I'm having trouble doing a certain kind of meditative practice. In a couple of letters, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad reprimands the king for being lax on his practices. Says, I'm going to withdraw my concentration from you unless you get your act together. In some, there's financial things going back and forth. Someone gets in trouble, they have to be bailed out. I found another letter where the same king writes to Hafiz Daraz. This is the gentleman who took on the Mujahideen movement. The king poses 17 questions on ontology, epistemology, medicine, fiqh, logic, theology, hadith, grammar, and so on. And he wants answers to them from the scholar in Peshawar. He says, the scholar says, Hafiz Daraz says, I would love to come, but I have to finish a book. So perhaps when the book is done, I'll be able to make the trip. Now, it's this very same king, Shah Murad's son Amir Haydar, who actually personally invites Bibi Sahiba, the great female sheikh of Kabul and Kandahar, to Bukhara, if you were there at last year's lecture. Now, just to give you a sense of the adab of the age, at one stage, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad asked the king, now this is the younger king, to see him at the dargah, at the khanaqah. Now, when the king arrives, he sees a line there of a group of disciples who are waiting for personalized meditation sessions for the muraqabah. Since the Pir had asked for him, the king goes to the front of the line, and one of the disciples there actually grabs the king by the collar and says, get to the back of the line. And the king just puts his head down and goes to the back of the line. Word gets to Hazrat Fazl Ahmad that the king is waiting there. They come out, they all have a big laugh, and then he says, no, come on, you can cut the line, I've got something important to talk to you about. Now again, it's irrelevant as to, I would argue that this did happen because it's been documented in a contemporary source. It's also irrelevant whether this actually happened or not. Just think about the kind of social mores and the adab that are communicated through this particular episode. Now, it's under the influence of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad and his contemporaries that a new ethos of governance emerges in Bukhara, as Shah Murad actively brought the Mujaddidi ethic into his rule. So at a personal level, Shah Murad carries himself like a darvish. In fact, he walks with his head down through the streets, keeping only 4 dirhams a day for his family expenses, and he even writes a book on tafsir. At the same time, he reduces tax burdens and curbs corruption. Perhaps most significant, especially to me as an academic, this is really something that we wish would happen today. He patronizes education and the Sufi sciences to such a degree that by the end of his reign, Bukhara is transformed into a seat of learning, boasting 80 madrasas by the early 19th century, 365 by 1860. I have a friend in Tashkent who actually documented virtually all of them. Again, this is not just a representative number. They say that over 30,000 students were supported by the state, so a huge chunk of the budget actually goes into education. In fact, even when Moorcroft's secretary, Mir Zatullah, who's a very well-known scholar, he's coming through Kokand, which is a neighboring kingdom. First thing the king does is, like, he says, I want to buy your services. Can you be the head of one of the madrasas here? So it's kind of they're vying for the Sufis and the madrasas. Now, as Bukhara's academies grow, the Durrani state actually provides stipends for students to study there. By 1808, an extensive scholastic exchange exists between Peshawar and Bukhara. Still, by the way, more students are coming south to Peshawar than vice versa. And of course, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's institutions form part of this exchange. Now, from Shah Murad's reign onwards, a new model of kingship emerges, drawing together Mongol and Persian models, but within a Mujaddidi ethical consciousness. Royal histories actually begin the entries on the reign of Shah Murad with the hadith of Tajdeed, that every 100 years a Mujaddid or a reviver will appear to renew the religion. Shah Murad is referenced explicitly as the Mujaddid of the century. The chronicles present the time before him as a period of archetypal decline and disorder, in which a young prince meets a dervish, assumes the throne exactly in the year 1200, so he's fortunate that he gets in 1200 to be the Mujaddid. Now then he revives the Sunnah. Now the ideal king is still the soldier, the Perso-Turkic empire builder, and the administrator. But to this is added the humble ascetic scholar, the accessible supporter of the masses, the patron of the Khanaqahs and madrasas, and the Sufi miracle worker, the dust of whose grave has miraculous healing properties. Now, with patronage from both sides of the Oxus, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's order rapidly spread across Asia. His last trip to Bukhara was in 1814, and he passed away 2 years later in Peshawar in 1816, where he's buried. Now, his successors highlight the degree to which Sufi lineages like Fazl Ahmad's tie together the regions north and south of the Oxus, or let's say beyond the Oxus and Indus to reference the book. Now, a well-known Indian traveler and diplomat, Mohanlal Kashmiri, describes Fazl Ahmad's son in Peshawar as the saint of all of Peshawar and Turkestan. Incidentally, the son also led tribal forces against the invading Sikhs in a very famous the Battle of Nowshera. Fazl Ahmad's son and successor in Bukhara was a teacher of the great Tatar scholar Shahabuddin Marjani. This is probably the greatest scholar that Tatarstan produced in the 19th century. He's a scholar reformer, and he praises him in his writings, saying that half of Bukhara came to Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's son's funeral. His son was actually the Pesh Imam of this mosque, and several of the great Siberian sheikhs were there, khalifas, who pondered over such questions as to whether the evening prayers could be skipped in the event of 3 hours of daylight. This is actually a question that's posed. Actually, Siberia has this incredible scholastic renaissance that's happening. It begins in the 18th century and then sort of moves on into the 19th. It's a side story. Again, read the book. So, Fazl Ahmad's son in Kokand in Farhana was almost like the patron saint of the Khanat. His disciple was Muqimi, who was one of the greatest poets of the Chagatai, the Uzbek language. Another family member was a famous ambassador to St. Petersburg, who negotiated with Tsar Nicholas on behalf of Kokand, and he's seen as an incredible diplomat and administrator. There's a diary of his actually sitting in St. Petersburg that I have to get my hands on. One of the largest madrasas in Xinjiang in China, until the 20th century, the Chong madrasa, was part of Fazl Ahmad's lineage via Kyrgyzstan. Now, surprisingly, the last of Fazl Ahmad's great descendants in the latter 20th century was the last great saint of North Waziristan, who was the peer of the tribal belt on both sides of the border through all the brutal Afghan wars. So he was in fact part of the Khuday Khidmat Guard at first, and then he's got a phenomenal career. I will tell you why I'm particularly interested in him. He's got 80 khalifas on both sides of the border who he actually who are functional throughout all of the wars. He Several of the Khalifas are still alive. He even ran a publishing house with books on Sunni doctrine, on metaphysics, on philosophy, on poetry, and meditation in four languages, one publishing house in North Waziristan, the other in Thana Malaka. Now, I'm finishing up right now. So by the way, this is one of the Sufi cemeteries associated with this order. So I'm just going to do a quick shout out to a project that I'm doing right now. I've been doing for the last 2 years. It's coming to a close right now on digitizing all of his manuscripts and letters, some in fact to female disciples, attesting to the fact that Hazrat Fazl Ahmad Sufi Silsila is still very much alive even in the ungovernable tribal belt in the 21st century. So I'm very close to his descendants in this on both sides of the border. And I remember at a certain stage about 7 years ago, I asked several of them the question, what is sitting in North Waziristan? This is before it was accessible. At that stage, we had no clue, and then bit by bit, stuff started pouring out. So we're doing his whole collected works, his published works, his maktubat, his letters, and then the largest Sufi library in Peshawar, this is the Amir Shah Qadri Library, also signed on, so we're doing their manuscripts, and God bless the librarian of that Khanaka, who is brilliant and a gem, and may continue to thrive. Within the first 2 months of our project, which is digitizing and cataloging and also assembling, he started a WhatsApp group and got about 120 local scholars, Sufis, on board in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the Kabul Valley, who eventually want to join the project. It's far more than I can handle. So there's a thirst. 1 minute. All right. So now I'd like to finish off actually with this image of image of this shajra at Fazl Ahmad's grave in today's Peshawar. This tree gives a sense of how all the branches of the Mujaddidi lineage are interconnected in the Mujaddidi consciousness even today, covering modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. We've got Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's line in the center, and you're also going to see the famous line in brown of, not brown, it's the blue one, of Hazrat Mirza Masar Jan Janan Ghulam Ali Dehrawi, where Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan spent his youth. That was his peer and his mother's peer. And so on and so forth, and then the largest silsila in Afghanistan. What stands out here is the complete absence of Central Asia, representing the breaking of the historical chains that I discussed, a direct result of the partitions from the British-Russian Great Game, the process which I trace in my book. So I hope that this rather detailed, lengthy presentation will give you a sense of the many ways in which the Sufi network functioned. So in summary, what emerges from this story is a vast zone of highly complex intellectual and spiritual discourse, reaching well into the tribal and Kohistani regions, a zone mediated by Sufis who incorporated both spiritual and practical knowledge systems, a thread that brought together the world on both sides of the Oxus and the Indus rivers. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Waleed. We probably have an azan break, and then we'll probably have a couple of questions, and then we'll open the floor to the guests, actually. Thanks. Hello. Okay. So until we hear the azan, I'll just start off with one question that kind of is something that I would really be interested in finding out. And that is, how would you say your study can help us rethink the historical narrative of Pakistan, which is so deeply informed by colonial histories? Oh, sorry, I can again ask that. How would you say your study can help us rethink the historical narrative of Pakistan, which is so deeply informed by colonial histories?
Okay, so I'm going to argue that again, this is less my doing than what the sources actually unveil, is incredibly important to the identity and the dignity of the people who inhabit this region. As I mentioned throughout the presentation, that when you are told that your culture and let's say your very ethos is one of losing your temper fast, and when heroism is seen as picking up a gun at the wrong times, there are obviously right times to pick up guns as well, then you end up actually becoming like this caricature of yourself, right? The colonial caricature becomes reality. Now, again, I brought up the Sialkot issue, I brought up Peshawar because we are so attuned to thinking, let's say, of Peshawar as the frontier, as basically it's the land, it's the areas where beyond which, or the Oxus River, beyond which Alexander did not dare venture, and therefore the lands of lawlessness and barbarism and so on and so forth. And what this ends up doing is we actually end up missing out on the sources that are actually very present. What do we end up doing? We begin our, pardon my French, we begin uh, our damned excursions with the colonial archive. Nothing wrong with the colonial archive, it's extremely useful, but it actually locks you into a certain way of thinking. The colonial archive has no idea what to do with the Sufi networks. The Russians are slightly better. You've got Khanikov and people like that who actually did venture into these territories. The British archives don't really care about this region unless it is a political problem. So already, what makes up a huge chunk of what we make today called civil society is a problem, right? It's only seen from the vantage point of where it's a political problem. Then what do? We go into the state narratives, right? The court chronicles. Great. I also love court chronicles. Once again, the court chronicles are, for the 18th, 19th century, telling you stories of fledgling kingdoms that don't last many generations. So what I would encourage everyone to do, and myself to do, is to actually go beyond. There are incredible amounts of sources sitting in collections all across this country, all across Afghanistan, much more centralized in Uzbekistan, that we don't touch because we assume they're just sort of religious works and we put them aside, right? What do you do with manuals of meditation? What do you do with 40 copies? There's a lot you can do with that. So, shall I start? Okay. So, so once again, it's important to look at the sources and then to sort of recenter each of these regions. I mean, Peshawar is the capital of a kingdom that encompasses Sabdiana, the largest Buddhist stupa in the world. When I see Peshawar, that's what I see. I'm not discounting everything else, but it's important to actually see the things that have been erased in order to then see a very different legacy and potential of a particular city. And then things start emerging. Things that are invisible actually start emerging. I would also say it's important, this kind of study is important to understand again what the spiritual and scholastic fabric of this region looked like. It is either a bunch of hardline guys in seminaries, neither is it a bunch of guys with kashos who are getting high. Right? We love to think that. Generally one or the other. It's not. And we have to understand that it is a complicated world. The word conservatism that we actually use does not apply in the past. We have to think beyond the liberal conservative binaries that we have fed and that are being manufactured, I'm sorry to say, in New York City and Washington, D.C. They're okay for there, not necessarily for the 18th century. So we have to create new paradigms in which to actually explore society. And finally, what I'll say is, we talk about Sufism, we talk about all of these great Sufi figures that make up this land, and Data Ali Hajweri from Ghazni, and Abdullah Ansari, and all of the big figures, Chishte Sharif, and so on and so forth. But we rarely ask, what did the society look like when these people were doing what they were doing? That's key. Because tasawwuf does not exist within the books of poetry, and there's a colonial sort of narrative that tells us that in order to understand Rumi, you just read the Masnavi and assume he's basically a guy wandering, right? You need to understand the people in that age knew where he was coming from, so you didn't really have to explain that. But when you look purely at one source, it immediately takes you into a direction where you discount the holistic picture of what these people were doing. And I just, ultimately, if I think about your family and the type of production, generation for generation for generation, that after Hazrat Muhammad Zaman Awari, um, that what was coming out of there gives you a sense that they are the poets, they are the jurists, they are writing the commentaries on the Masnavi, and they are writing commentaries in Ibn Arabi and on Bukhari Sharif, right? So all of a sudden we bring a complexity to this particular, and we reform, we think about what boundaries look like, we think about what orthodoxy and heterodoxy look like in very, very different ways. We don't fool ourselves that the world was a perfectly liberal world or a perfectly conservative world. We come to grips with our past, and any community that comes to grips with its past and comes to grips with the contradictions in its present. And if we're not able to understand those contradictions and those subtleties, then we lose our foundation, we lose our footing.
Thank you. I think we'll just wait for a few minutes and then we'll open the floor. No? Okay. So that's it. And should we open the floor? Okay, great. I think we can take a couple of questions, please. There is a cordless mic that should be floating around between you. Sure. If you can be loud enough until the cordless happens to you. Okay.
Thank you. That was an utterly fabulous talk, and I can't wait to read the book. And the book coming on as well. My question was really, as someone working on the 20th century in this region, really thinking about ways in which the colonial archive, and not only is the kind of mediated source you speak of, but has also dismantled and destroyed those institutions of knowledge and the continuities of it. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the destruction and the context of that destruction in which the archive making work that you're doing, the fabulous archive making work that you're doing, is nestled in. In some ways, it sounds like what you've also found through these sources is sites of survival and continuity against all odds. And the kind of continuity that we might need to really invest in a much more, and if you can speak or think about what that would entail.
Um, Thank you so much. This is an absolutely key question, and thank you for. I mean, you've answered a lot of it yourself. I mean, we are trying to actually recover things that are left in pieces, right? So, a lot of this is the story of really what happens to these networks, which I tell here. Part of it, of course, is when the new nation state of Afghanistan is formed in the 1800s very deliberately. Amir Abdur Rahman is set up by the British, and then he wipes out the Hazaras and converts the Kafirs, wipes out the Sufi leadership. He's doing this on a British stipend. And more importantly than that, from my story, at that stage you end up having now a buffer between what we now call Central Asia and Southern Asia. And that actually breaks a lot of the knowledge exchange, right? So things just end up getting scattered. Even more so than that, the issue is modernity and fundamentalism itself. Now, of course, for all of those who know fundamentalism is part and parcel of modernity, the modernists and the fundamentalists are actually share the same epistemology. Basically, tradition is no longer valuable, and we look at the world from a materialistic vantage point. In other words, how the heck does a meditative practice of subtle points help a new industrial revolution? I don't see widgets coming out of it, and therefore we toss it out, right? Then we toss out the whole mother curriculum, except for a few things. So in many cases, that kind of the de-emphasizing of these as valid knowledge systems have then meant that all of us are responsible for the decay. So how does the decay look? It's not just the destruction in 1857 of the Khanatay Nazariya library, bits and pieces of which are now sitting in the British Library in London. It is about now, and Firsad, you can back me up on this, some Gadi machine who then sells part of the collection or leaves it in a box that then gets wet, right? These are the stories that we hear all the time. So, I mean, this is what we're really up against. There are still tons of materials out there. There is still a lot of continuity. It is but a weak shadow of its former self, often a very corrupted shadow of its former self. So we have to allow for that. We have to allow for the fact that some of the people that we're dealing with are not their ancestors. Um, so in many cases, you actually have colonial policies that systematically destroyed these archives from internally. So, for example, in Sindh, when Napier takes over, the next 20 years are all of the Sufi Turuk who want to have their lands reinstated have to show up at the commissioner's office, and they're all going to be given a number according to the number of disciples, which is sick, right? Because the Sufi is not gauged on their number of disciples. It's gauged on something that is supposed to actually not be tangible. Then what happens is they institute primogeniture for the Waqf. If you end up with someone who's a prodigal son, ends up wasting it away and becoming a cult leader. And the changes happen so fast internally. In most of these cases, the archives also end up getting destroyed. So I guess what I would urge here is that there is um, there's a ton of material there. It's sometimes very hard to find. The work I was doing in Tarbaka actually meant 30 villages in Tarbaka following leads that often lead absolutely nowhere. I personally think that makes the work more rewarding because then you see the manuscripts in their natural habitat.
Many, many thanks. I would now request our Managing Trustee, Hamid Harun sir, to please.
Well, I come with a sinful temptation and a short announcement. The sinful temptation is to pick up this beautiful Harvard University Press book of the Hidden Caliphate lying up there, which doesn't belong to me. Not one of those nasty urban habits that we've picked up while subverting the natural order of urban, rural, frontier, and marginal as a result of colonial historiography. What I want to say is that this is the only austere, hard-rocked, brilliant lecture that we have in the series. The rest are multicultural, multidimensional, even multi-art and music elements throughout them, only because it is not easy to find someone of the excellent caliber of Waleed Ziad. The fact that so many of you have stayed glued to your seats is a clear example of that. My friends, he has triumphed with the ultimate insult that we're not going to Peshawar to look at the barbarians stretching out in Xinjiang, Bukhara, and various khanates like Khiva and God knows where else. We are, in fact, those who are the descendants of the barbarians within ourselves. We are the descendants of those commissioners. We are the descendants of so many of those Khan Bahadurs and Sirs and so many other things who have helped try to galvanize networks in urban society, and the fact that our urban society is a cause of decay or an interactive process of decay that has spread out to the rural areas and to the nomadic lands. It's pretty clear those nomadic lands and those steppes and those rural hinterlands, how did they integrate into one kind of philosophy, one kind of interaction? This is what Waleed's lecture is so brilliant about. So instead of offering you Russian caravan tea, it's chai in Russia and chai in China. Sometimes Sina has a shortage of creativity. She's going to offer you ordinary tea. No spiritual sustenance. Waleed has given you enough of that. But I would invite him and all of you to come and join us for some tea before you go home. Thank you so much for coming. And please watch the program because there are some very exciting events left. Not least of all, there are musical performances, short recitals, which go at the tail end of programs to give you an integrated picture of the societies that the lead shows. We have almost lost, except we go to Tampanga and such places to find rural manuscripts. So beyond rural manuscripts of the Hidden Caliphate, and thank you so much, Waleed, for an excellent lecture.